Well, good morning, my dear students. I pray that you are all feeling blessed today as I am. God is good even in difficult situations. If you are just like me, who's overwhelmed many times every day, I always remind myself the same way I want to remind you that those are the sweetest moments when you and I need to be totally dependent on the Lord, especially through those difficult circumstances. I'm sure you will all agree with me on that. Since you heard from me last Friday, you will be hearing from me at the beginning of each class period to give you the following: your classwork, your homework, if there's any, standards and procedures I have established and trained you since the beginning of the school year that you must observe during class for the very reason of keeping you accountable with your behavior. I know I can count on you to be on your best behavior whether I'm with you in school or not because you're an awesome class. So keep it up. Now that I'm done with my introduction, let me move on by detailing with you the task for today. You will wait for me when I tell you to get a copy of the Cornell Notes to write important information from my presentation today because you'll need these notes to answer the activity for Lesson 2 of Chapter 1. Please be mindful to do this procedure quietly or Mrs. B will send me names of those talking during this procedure or while completing the classwork, and even if there's anyone who's distracting others during my presentation. Let me also remind you that those not on task can also get a detention for not following instruction. I will be the one to write them on the discipline log and notify Pastor Joe. But I'm confident you will complete your classwork without any discipline issues. Before I forget, I also want to give you this instruction. At the end of the class period or after you worked on the activity worksheet, you will ask Mrs. B for her initial. After the note-taking for exit ticket, as proof that you completed today's Cornell Notes so you can get and earn full credit for this section of the chapter. Without Mrs. B's initial, you will get partial credit, so don't leave the class without asking Mrs. B to initial your work. So at this time, you may want to pause this presentation before I go further so that you can get a copy of your Cornell Notes. But remember, get your Cornell Notes without talking because Mrs. B will be looking out for talkers. Let me begin the history of credit and debt in America by saying that its beginning can be traced from the prevailing thought and thinking of the time. Why do I say this? It is because credit and debt is part of American culture, which consequently became a part of the American life. And you would wonder why. Well, it's because credit card companies spend its time and effort to convince Americans that credit is the normal way to get what you want. Banks and other lending companies promote credit to get us to buy. What is the result? A huge credit problem that we talked about and covered in Lesson 1. Americans now believe that debt is a necessary part of their financial life. And as a result, many Americans don't think twice about carrying a credit card that charges up to 23% or even higher, especially with the current inflation. Now let me talk about the history behind why Americans got into credit and debt. After World War I, the country entered into a period in U.S. history called the Roaring Twenties, which is described as a decade long of economic boom or prosperity. Mass production of consumer goods became the norm. Americans wanted the new mass-produced products, but they didn't have the money. To keep up with the trends of the economic prosperity, an average American got a line of credit from financial institutions such as credit card companies, banks, and other lending institutions. Credit became more acceptable. and this was the beginning of what is now we know as the credit industry. Prior to 1920, it had never been legal to lenders to charge interest rates high enough to change to a profit. Credit was largely unavailable to the public. But that changed drastically, especially when the stock market crashed in 1929, because it launched the country into the Great Depression in the 1930s. Millions of people were out of work and lost almost everything, if not all of their possessions. From the roaring 20s or economic prosperity that United States have experienced, during the 1930s, it experienced a historic economic disaster. It was the worst time for majority of the Americans. So the government had to step in, and President Franklin D. Roosevelt passed a law called the New Deal. It was a program designed to promote economic recovery and social reform to help the working class Americans get back on their feet. The New Deal programs helped improve the lives of people suffering from the events of the Depression, especially the needy and the poor, so that they could recover financially. However, in the long run, New Deal programs set a precedent for the federal government to play a key role in the economic and social affairs of the nation. In fact, the government stepped in to help the American people in a huge way, which marked the start of big government through its various programs. Included in the financial recovery program of the New Deal, it also helped Americans establish home mortgage and convince financial institutions such as the banks and other lending institutions that consumer credit could be a profitable industry. As Americans began to recover from their horrible economic conditions through these government programs, the people once again became comfortable with the idea of borrowing money and going into debt. The next major event after the Great Depression was World War II. During this time, it helped end the Great Depression by creating new jobs for the war effort. While men went to war, those that were left, who were majority women, produced weapons, tanks, uniforms for the soldiers, and anything needed in order for the Allied countries to win the war against Germany and Japan. After the war, United States not only became a superpower politically and militarily, but she also became a nation that was strengthened economically speaking. So once again, people became comfortable with the idea of borrowing money and going into debt. The prosperity of the post-war era gave consumers confidence, and that's why they started financing large purchases, because there was more opportunity for secure employment and increasing salaries. Borrowing became socially acceptable. And that mindset continued on until the present-day America, which explains why 71% are considered living paycheck to paycheck and are buried in debt. So that concludes my presentation, and now let me move on to the next thing that we're going to do. When you get these copies from Mrs. B, please start working. Some of the answers for these questions can be found from your textbook on pages 7 to 10 or from the notes you took during my presentation. While completing this task, Mr. Sanchez, my student teacher, will be walking around the classroom to make sure you are all busy working on these activity worksheets. Your goal at least is to finish the first page, and depending on the time left, you may continue working on page 2 as your homework. However, it will be much better if you can finish both pages in class so you don't have to deal with any homework. These activity pages 1 and 2 with your Cornell notes must be turned into Google Classroom this Thursday on or before 7:45 a.m. I'm hoping that I gave you enough clear instruction to finish your classwork today. Before I go, I just want to make sure to mention to you that I have noticed a few of you still not turning in work on time. So here are my important reminders, and please pay attention carefully. First, only 3 late works are allowed. Any late work after that will be graded as NC. Second, Friday is the ending of the grading period. Any work eligible for late credit must be turned in on Thursday. If any work is not turned in after 2 days from the deadline, it's considered no credit or 0%. I have emailed some of your parents for some unsubmitted work. To some, I even extended grace. But unfortunately, I still do not see from a few of you any changes in your work ethics. Remember, when you do your best, you are honoring the Lord with your study habits since you are full-time students, okay? I will be back on Thursday, so for now, let me just bid you goodbye and have a great rest of your day.